In early 2021, assembly lines at some of Germany's most advanced car factories fell eerily silent. Not because demand dried up, but for lack of a few dollars' worth of microchips. A global semiconductor shortage, driven by pandemic disruptions, freak events like factory fires, and surging electronics demand, had left automakers scrambling. For Germany's auto industry, it was the worst chip supply crunch in 30 years, with 83% of companies affected and production suddenly stopped on multiple lines. All this chaos was caused not by cutting-edge 5-nanometer chips, but by unglamorous mature node semiconductors, the kind that control windshield wipers or fuel injection. Why would TSMC, the world's leading maker of ultra-advanced chips, respond by building its first European factory to make these older chips? In 2021, the phrase silicon shortage entered the lexicon of every automaker. Car makers had slashed chip orders early in the pandemic, only to be caught flat-footed when car demand rebounded and consumer electronics gobbled up chip capacity. The result was a crippling bottleneck for automotive semiconductors. Modern cars can carry hundreds of chips for everything from engine management to airbags, and without those pieces, even a half-finished BMW or VW couldn't leave the factory. By August 2021, industry surveys showed German car companies facing their most severe component shortage in decades. Volkswagen, the country's largest automaker, had to temporarily halt production of certain models, including electric cars in Zwickau and Dresden, simply because the chips weren't there. What was shocking was which chips were missing. It wasn't the latest AI processors or smartphone SoCs in short supply. It was older, proven chips made on mature manufacturing nodes, typically 28 nanometers and up. These legacy chips run on established technologies often a decade old, yet they're the workhorses of automotive electronics. Microcontroller units, MCUs for braking systems, power management, ICs for engines, simple sensors. All are usually built on larger transistor nodes that emphasize reliability over raw speed. Automakers had long treated such chips as low-cost commodities, easily sourced from a global supply chain. But when a perfect storm hit, a fire knocking out a major Renesas automotive chip fab in Japan, a cold snap idling plants in Texas, and pandemic logistics chaos, those unassuming chips became the industry's Achilles heel. The 2021 shortage hammered home a lesson. Mature node chips matter. In fact, during the crisis, the US Commerce Department found the most acute shortages were in chips 40 nanometers and larger, not the cutting-edge ones. Prices for some basic auto semiconductors jumped fivefold as suppliers struggled to keep up. Europe's car makers, from premium brands to mass market, suddenly realized that having the world's most sophisticated factories means little if a dollar chip is unavailable. As one German researcher noted amid the crunch, this is leading to production stoppages, and it would take well into 2022 to even begin restoring balance. In short, the crisis revealed a strategic vulnerability. Europe's automotive heart was reliant on distant chip foundries running older processes, mostly in Asia. Enter TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Co., the undisputed giant of contract chip making. In August 2023, TSMC announced it would team up with 3 European tech firms to build a new fab in Dresden, Germany. This project became known as the European Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, ESMC. Its ownership structure is telling. TSMC holds 70%, while Germany's Bosch and Europe's 2 largest semiconductor players, Infineon and NXP, each take a 10% stake. In practice, that means TSMC is firmly in the driver's seat. It will operate the fab and bring its process technology. But the local partners have just enough skin in the game, and political clout, to make this a European endeavor. Why this joint venture structure? One reason is risk sharing and commitment. Each of the three 10% stakeholders ponied up around €500 million for their slice of ESMC. These companies, Bosch, Infineon, NXP, aren't just investors. They are anchor customers. All are top suppliers of automotive chips and stand to benefit directly from a nearby state-of-the-art foundry. By investing, they help fund the massive startup costs while also securing priority capacity for their own chip designs. It's a bit like booking your seat on the lifeboat before the next storm hits. In the press release, Bosch's CEO emphasized that reliable access to semiconductors is critical for the auto industry's success, and that partnering with TSMC near Bosch's own Dresden fab will strengthen the semiconductor ecosystem right in Bosch's backyard. In other words, Bosch and friends are effectively paying to bring TSMC to them, an insurance policy against future shortages. For TSMC, having local partners also greases the wheels in an unfamiliar market. These companies understand European labor rules, local supply chains, and of course have long-standing relationships with European governments and automakers. Infineon's CEO hailed the joint investment as a milestone that would bolster Europe's semiconductor ecosystem and feed growing auto and IoT demand. Their involvement likely reassures policymakers that this isn't just a branch plant of TSMC, but a collaborative effort to build know-how in the region. It's a model TSMC has used elsewhere. In Japan, it set up a similar joint venture with Sony, and later Denso, for a new fab, leveraging Sony's local presence and Japan's subsidy support. In the US, by contrast, TSMC's Arizona fab is wholly owned by TSMC. But even there, it relies heavily on partnerships with big customers like Apple and on US government incentives to justify the investment. Notably, the Dresden fab will not produce TSMC's most advanced chips, no 3nm or 5nm processors here. Instead, ESMC is slated to churn out 300mm wafers using 28/22nm planar CMOS and 16/12nm FinFET technology. In plain English, that covers chips a few generations behind the bleeding edge, but perfectly suited for automotive and industrial uses. Those nodes, 28nm, 22nm, 16nm, etc., are workhorses for making microcontrollers, power management chips, radar sensors, and connectivity chips that go into cars, factory equipment, and IoT devices. They also include FinFET transistors at 1612nm, which is relatively advanced for auto chips, bringing better performance and power efficiency to things like advanced driver assistance systems. By offering this range, the Dresden fab will give Europe a dose of modern chip production that is slightly behind the most advanced technology, but in the range most important for automotive and other industrial applications. TSMC itself stressed the plant will be an important source of MCUs, the brains in car subsystems from power windows to braking sensors. This strategy mirrors what TSMC did with its Japanese fab. The first phase in Japan makes 28nm to 12nm chips for Sony's cameras and Denso's car parts, while a second phase will even introduce 7nm for more advanced chips by 2027. In Europe's case, only one phase is announced so far, and it focuses on the mature processes up to 12nm. That's still a big step for Europe's semiconductor scene. Remember, Europe currently has zero production of cutting-edge sub-10nm chips. Even Intel's planned Magdeburg fab, if it materializes, won't produce anything until late this decade. So 16nm FinFET in Dresden will actually be among the most advanced nodes produced on European soil when it comes online. And crucially, its capacity dedicated to the types of chips Europe's industries use heavily, rather than, say, smartphone processors that Europe mostly imports in finished products. Another strategic aspect is that ESMC will run as an open foundry. The European Commission made it a condition for subsidies that the fab must accept orders from any European customer, including smaller firms and even research outfits, not just the big three partners. This open access model means the fab could serve a broad swath of Europe's tech sector. Bosch, Infineon, and NXP will certainly leverage it for their own chip designs, but a smaller auto parts supplier or a European startup designing, say, a new industrial sensor chip could also contract manufacturing there. That's important for building a more resilient supply chain. The more companies that can tap into local production, the less dependent they are on distant fabs with long lead times. In theory, it also means the fab can run at higher utilization by aggregating demand from many clients, not just the 3 shareholders. None of this would be happening without a big push from European policymakers. The 2021 auto chip fiasco was a rude awakening for Europe, which had seen its share of global semiconductor manufacturing sink to under 10% in recent years. The European Union responded by formulating the European Chips Act, unveiled in early 2022, with the headline goal of doubling Europe's market share in chips to 20% by 2030. Lofty as that is, the message was clear. Europe needed to get back in the game of chip production, or risk permanent dependence on foreign suppliers for foundational technologies. The EU Chips Act set aside a pot of €43 billion in public and private funds to attract semiconductor investments. In practice, it meant EU member states could deploy generous subsidies for chip fabs without falling foul of usual EU state aid limits. Germany, in particular, went on a spending spree to court chip makers. Intel was offered a subsidy package reportedly around €10 billion, later bumped up, for an advanced fab in Magdeburg, and other projects by European firms like ST Microelectronics also got support. TSMC's Dresden plant became the flagship win for the CHIPS Act program. In August 2024, the European Commission officially approved €5 billion in state aid for the ESMC project, roughly covering half of the €10 billion total cost. It's the single largest CHIPS Act subsidy granted so far, and notably, it's the first under the Act to land in Germany. European leaders framed the TSMC deal as a major victory. At the Dresden groundbreaking ceremony, EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen called it a true win-win situation for all of us. Europe secures a key supply of chips, and TSMC expands into a new market. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, standing in the heart of Silicon Saxony, as the Dresden region is nicknamed, underscored that access to semiconductors is a central issue for Germany. This project was sold politically as securing the industrial future of Europe's largest economy. For a country whose identity is tightly bound to automobile engineering, having chip fabs on German soil is as much about pride and strategic autonomy as about economics. The Dresden fab is scheduled to start production by 2027, which is lightning speed by European standards. The government's eagerness is evident. Germany's economy minister pledged to do everything possible to ensure the plant opens on time, perhaps mindful of the delays and cost overruns that have plagued some other high-tech projects. The public money certainly helped move things along. TSMC's final investment decision was explicitly hinged on getting adequate public funding. Once the subsidy was approved, construction literally began within days, with the groundbreaking in August 2024 featuring both German and EU top officials. In essence, the CHIPS Act provided the golden handshake to entice TSMC. From a policy perspective, this investment is seen as a cornerstone for building a wider semiconductor ecosystem in Europe. It's not just one factory. It's expected to attract suppliers, talent, and R&D around it. Dresden was a logical choice because it already hosts other chip fabs and research institutions. Infineon runs a huge fab there. Global Foundries, formerly AMD's manufacturing arm, has a facility, and Bosch recently opened its own $1 billion fab in Dresden as well. The region has branded itself Silicon Saxony and counts over 2,000 semiconductor-related companies in its cluster. By landing TSMC, Germany essentially bolstered Dresden's status as Europe's semiconductor capital. Crucially, ESMC helps fulfill the resilience goal of European industrial policy. The nightmare scenario for European car makers is another supply crunch that they have zero control over. With a local fab dedicated to auto-grade chips, Europe gets a buffer. Even if global supply gets tight, a portion of capacity is physically in Europe and, by virtue of politics and proximity, likely to prioritize European needs. It's akin to how countries think about energy security. Just as Europe invests in domestic energy sources to avoid total reliance on imports, it's now investing in chip capacity for supply security. Ursula von der Leyen explicitly linked the Dresden plant to improving Europe's resiliency in case of future chip shortages of the kind seen during COVID. Financially, some critics might note that a 50% subsidy is very high. Essentially, European taxpayers are footing half the bill so that companies like TSMC and its partners will operate there. But in the context of global chip nationalism, this level of subsidy has become almost the norm. The US is offering hefty grants and tax credits for fabs under its CHIPS Act. Japan covered about 40% of TSMC's Kumamoto fab cost, and Germany even upped Intel's subsidy to over 10 billion euros when Intel said costs had risen. Seen this way, Europe felt it had to pay the going rate to attract top semiconductor investment. And for the EU, landing the world's biggest chip maker carries symbolic weight. It shows that Europe can play with the big boys in tech if it puts money on the table. One more policy angle. The ESMC fab also advances Europe's goal of technological sovereignty. For years, EU officials fretted that Europe was becoming just a consumer of other regions' tech, rather than a producer. Having a TSMC-run fab in Germany means cutting-edge manufacturing knowledge will be present on European soil. It won't make Europe self-sufficient in chips, far from it, but it's a step toward balancing a supply chain that was heavily tilted toward Asia. The CHIPS Act isn't just about getting chips, it's about ensuring Europe maintains influence in the semiconductor value chain, from research to fabrication. If successful, the Dresden fab could be a case study in public-private collaboration, a blend of Taiwanese know-how, European industry participation, and government backing, all to secure a strategic resource. TSMC's decision to plant its flag in Germany is part of a larger geopolitical realignment of the semiconductor world. Over the past few years, TSMC has been carefully expanding its footprint beyond Taiwan, but notably only into countries that are close security partners of Taiwan's main ally, the United States. The company now has major projects in the US, Japan, and the EU, all of which are aligned in their tech policies and concerns about over-reliance on Asia. This effectively knits TSMC into the industrial ecosystems of the US-EU-Japan bloc. It's no coincidence that these are the same regions coordinating on high-tech export controls and aiming to stay ahead of China in semiconductor capabilities. By investing in friendly territories, TSMC is bolstering what one might call an alliance of chip consumers and producers that trust each other. There's a defensive logic for TSMC here. Diversifying manufacturing locations mitigates risk. The geopolitical risk of having all cutting-edge capacity in Taiwan, which lies uncomfortably close to China, has been a cloud hanging over the industry. Western customers and governments have been subtly, and sometimes bluntly, pushing TSMC to build elsewhere to ensure supply continuity if, say, a crisis disrupted Taiwan. TSMC's CEO C.C. Wei diplomatically framed the Dresden fab as bringing TSMC closer to its customers in Europe, but the subtext is also bringing TSMC closer to the centers of power in Europe. A chip plant on German soil intertwines TSMC's fate with Europe's. If tensions ever rise in East Asia, European leaders will have a stake in TSMC's stability because their own factories and jobs depend on its output. This is sometimes referred to as the silicon shield concept, traditionally meaning Taiwan's chip dominance deters adversaries, now extended via overseas fabs. By aligning itself with the West through huge investments, TSMC is arguably reinforcing a broader silicon shield around itself. Washington, Brussels, Tokyo, all have deep interest in keeping TSMC running smoothly. In fact, TSMC announced a whopping $100 billion expansion plan covering new facilities in Arizona, Japan, and Europe. These moves ingratiate the company, and by extension, Taiwan's tech sector, with key allies. It's a form of chip diplomacy. Instead of just selling chips, TSMC is building long-term partnerships, complete with local jobs and supplier networks, in countries that can influence global policy. However, this strategy raises a paradox. Taiwan's unique strategic value has long been that it produces the vast majority of the world's most advanced chips, a concentration often dubbed a silicon shield, because countries would think twice about letting harm come to such an essential player. Now, if the US, Europe, and Japan all develop their own TSMC-run fabs, albeit for older nodes, does that dilute Taiwan's centrality? TSMC appears to be walking a fine line. It is not transferring its bleeding-edge tech offshore. The Dresden fab's 16-nanometer processes, or Arizona's planned 3-nanometer line, will still lag one generation behind what's running in Taiwan. As one analysis noted, TSMC's best strategy is to keep its most advanced technology exclusively in Taiwan while expanding lower-end production abroad. That way, Taiwan remains irreplaceable for cutting-edge chips, while allies get local capacity for important but not cutting-edge chips. So far, that's exactly what's happening. Europe and Japan get 22/28 nanometers, and similar, the US will get 4 nanometers and 3 nanometers in a couple of years, but Taiwan keeps the absolute frontier processes at home. From Europe's perspective, having TSMC set up shop also has a geopolitical signal. It shows Taiwan and the EU deepening ties. While Europe doesn't have a defense pact with Taiwan, tech cooperation like this adds a layer of connection. Notably, the Dresden fab broke ground just as the EU was formulating a more cautious strategy on China and discussing de-risking its supply chains. By securing Taiwanese investment, Europe is implicitly hedging against being caught in a crossfire where it can't get chips from Asia. It's also a gentle nod of support for Taiwan as a high-tech partner, without making overt political statements. Taiwan's government has encouraged its chip firms to expand in friendly countries as part of its own geopolitical strategy. In that sense, ESMC is not just a commercial venture, but a product of Taipei's foreign policy meeting Brussels' industrial policy on common ground. That said, some wonder if by localizing production abroad, TSMC might inadvertently weaken Taiwan's leverage. If Europe, America, and Japan can source more of their needs internally, will they be less concerned about a disruption in Taiwan? The counterargument is that the volumes abroad will still be relatively small compared to global demand, and the cutting edge will remain in Taiwan for the foreseeable future. TSMC's overseas fabs, impressive as they sound, are still a drop in the bucket of its total capacity. TSMC's main fabs in Taiwan produce many times more wafers per month than the planned 40,000 in Dresden. So Taiwan's role remains critical, but now TSMC has enmeshed itself with key partners to a degree that any conflict affecting it would also directly hurt the US, EU, and Japan. In essence, TSMC is embedding itself in allied industrial bases as a form of mutual assurance.